Thank you for joining us as we explore one of the most unsettling instances in American history. We'll explore the events that rocked the Midwest in 1904 today, during a period when Illinois was still showing signs of change. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments section before we start. If anyone is following this story with us, please let me know. Illinois was a state of extreme differences at the beginning of the 20th century. While Chicago shone as a bustling manufacturing city full of immigrants and promising wealth, the state's interior preserved its rural rhythm, nearly overshadowed by the big city's quick development. To us today, the simplicity of life in the small farming settlements dotted across the central Illinois counties seems almost unthinkable. Endless wheat and maize fields are traversed by dirt roads. Families had been acquainted for many generations. When there were secrets, they were kept behind closed doors and out of sight of prying eyes. And life revolved with the seasons. Something mysterious started to happen in this seemingly tranquil environment. Central Illinois' Sangamon County was renowned for its hard-working communities and lush fields. Although Springfield, the state capital, was situated there, our attention is on a more remote region where fields spread for miles without any neighbors. The harsh cold of the American Midwest covered the region with a heavy layer of snow during that winter of 1904. Darkness appeared to engulf everything outside as night fell early. Little kerosene lanterns that flicker. That year's January saw temperatures drop well below freezing. Winters were hard for the locals, but this one looked particularly brutal. After snowfalls, roads remained impassable for days. There was complete seclusion. In a silent white ocean, farms turned into lone islands. People relied on one another in this type of setting, where the absence of a neighbor at a town meeting or church service was immediately concerning. On January 15th, a farmer by the name of Thomas. Something odd caught Brennan's attention. He saw something strange while riding the route that connected his farm to the tiny community of Mechanicsburg. The chimney of the Hartley farmhouse, a well-known family in the neighborhood, should have been the source of the smoke. However, it was nowhere to be seen. The lack of a fire was more than unusual on such a chilly morning, with temperatures close to -20 degrees. It might have been lethal. James Hartley and Thomas have been friends for more than 10 years. James was a diligent worker, in his early 40s, who managed a small yet fruitful land. There he lived with his wife, Margaret, a quiet woman well-liked in the neighborhood. In local social circles, the couple's childlessness was a topic of discreet conversation, but no one ventured to challenge it. They visited the village Baptist church on a regular basis, worked hard, and kept to themselves. Thomas paused for a second. He was extremely troubled by the scene, even if it wasn't conventional to violate someone's private. The house appeared to be dead. No, the wind howling across the deserted fields was the only sound and movement. He made the decision to come closer. After getting from his horse, he tethered the reins to a neighboring fence. As he made his way to the front entrance, the snow crunched under his boots. He knocked once, then twice. Nothing. He referred to Margaret and James by name. Complete quiet. At that moment, he became aware of something unsettling. There was a tiny crack in the door, but not enough to keep the cold wind out. With a moan of rusted hinges, the door swung open as Thomas gently pushed it. It was gloomy and icy inside the house. It wasn't only the weather causing his hands to tremble. He called again, his voice resonating through the deserted halls. Something was seriously amiss here. No response. Thomas stepped inside warily. The main area was messy, but not in a way that would indicate a fight. It was not the same. The furniture moved a little like someone had hurried out. Plates with food remnants that had already solidified in the freezer remained on the kitchen table, and a chair had toppled over. The hearth was dead. Dead. It was evident from the chilly ashes that no one had fed the fire in days or even a week. He looked around the other rooms. The bed was unmade in the couple's bedroom, and the blankets were tossed aside as though someone had woken up quickly. Drawers were open and clothes were strewn about. Thomas's heart began to pound. He looked everywhere for evidence of violence, mysterious stains, or anything that could account for the couple's departure. But all he discovered was the odd chaos and the piercing cold that filled the entire house. He went outside and looked at the barn and other structures on the land. Horses, chicks, and even cattle that ought to have been protected from the bitter cold were all dead and frozen from neglect. The scene was heartbreaking. Thomas was aware that he needed to alert the authorities. He got on his horse and rode back to Mechanicsburg, where he met William Porter, the local sheriff. Sheriff Porter was renowned for his methodical approach. After gathering several soldiers, he went back to the Hartley farm that afternoon. The team started to find more questions than answers as they looked about the property for hints. Not only was there no obvious proof of violent crime or indications of forced entrance, but there was also no explanation for the abrupt disappearance of a whole couple during a harsh winter. In the barn, investigators discovered something strange. A cart had been moved lately, possibly days ago, according to marks in the hardened snow. However, where had James and Margaret disappeared to on a chilly night, abandoning everything? How come they hadn't alerted anyone? Mechanicsburg was a small town. Everybody was acquainted with each other. There would be rumors if someone planned a vacation, particularly during this hazardous season. Sheriff Porter started interrogating their nearest neighbors. The majority hadn't seen the Hartleys in 10 days or more. The proprietor of the Mechanicsburg General Store, who remembered a brief discussion about seeds for the next season, was the last person to communicate with James. Nothing out of the ordinary. James appeared concerned about something, but the storekeeper explained it away as the usual winter tribulations. It had been even longer since Margaret had visited the city. She appeared more reclusive in recent weeks, according to some churchwomen, but at the time, nobody gave it any attention. As the days went by, word of the Hartleys' disappearance started to circulate across nearby counties. Short pieces requesting information were published in local newspapers. The mystery took over half a page in the Springfield Journal, characterizing the pair and requesting that anyone with information get in touch with the appropriate authorities. However, nothing resulted from it. It seemed as though Margaret Hartley and James had just disappeared into the bitter cold of that awful January. Details from preliminary investigations made the case even more perplexing. Sheriff Porter made the decision to conduct a more comprehensive search of the items left in the Hartley residence. James discovered correspondence that provided an alternative perspective on the papers and records kept in a drawer of his desk. The relatively straightforward existence of a couple. Correspondence with individuals in different states. Notebook entries referencing names unknown in the area, and bank transaction records indicating businesses other than farming. The sheriff was particularly interested in one letter. Dated November 1903, it was only 2 months before to the disappearance. It was signed by an unidentifiable individual in St. Louis, Missouri, using only their initials. Although the substance was ambiguous, it had a tone of urgency. It described a meeting that was scheduled for when winter arrived and talked of an opportunity that could not be missed. James was urged by the sender to keep everything private, even from Margaret. This finding fundamentally altered the course of the inquiry. Porter started to think that the disappearance might have been the consequence of a conscious choice rather than foul conduct. Maybe James Hartley had some dubious business to attend to and had to get out quickly. However, this didn't explain why they would abandon all they owned, including savings kept in a tin can buried in the barn found during the search, or why Margaret had also vanished. Authorities in St. Louis received telegrams from the sheriff requesting information on anyone who might be associated with the Hartleys. Due to communication issues at the time, the response was delayed by over 2 weeks. When it did show up, it carried unsettling news. Records showed that James Hartley was a man who has a history of business battles in the city, but nothing definitive. Dead ends appeared to be the case's constant outcome. Near the meantime, a little hamlet near Mechanicsburg started to hear tales. Speculation was stoked by the absence of responses. Weeks before to the disappearance, some neighbors reported seeing strangers in the neighborhood. One December night, a farmer claimed to have heard rising voices coming from the Hartley property, although he discounted them at the time. One of the residents reported seeing an unknown wagon traveling toward the couple's farm at twilight along the main road. Any large-scale search was challenging due to the severe winter. Volunteer groups were assembled by the authorities to search the surrounding areas, particularly the thick forests that encircle the rural homes. They searched for evidence that the couple might have tried to walk and perished from the cold, but everything was buried in snow, making any evidence difficult to find. Fearing a terrible event, frozen waterways were also examined. There was nothing discovered. Within, a new lead surfaced in February, when the cold finally started to break. In late January, a horse merchant who frequently traveled between Springfield and Decca claimed to have seen a couple that fit the Hartleys' description at a Decca inn. He claimed that a younger man he didn't know was with them. The three of them showed there quickly, paid in cash, and then left early the following morning, heading south. Sheriff Porter headed straight to Decatur with 2 deputies. The Mon County municipality was substantially bigger then. Travelers going to bigger cities used Mechanicsburg as a transit hub. The merchant's indicated inn was close to the train station, a crowded spot where it would be simple to overlook so many strangers. The story was corroborated by the innkeeper, an older man called Edmund Price. The woman appeared so apprehensive, even afraid, that he recalled the couple. During their visit, she hardly spoke at all. Edmund thought the older man was James, and he paid in advance and handled all the arrangements. The young man, the third person, waited outside while the rooms were set up. This individual, according to Edmund, was in his early 20s and was dressed simply but appropriately for travel. During the night, Edmund also brought up something the sheriff thought was important. From the couple's room, he heard voices. The tone seemed like an argument, but he couldn't make out the words. The woman was in tears. When they went downstairs to leave in the morning, she kept her eyes downcast and stayed very silent. Edmund didn't want to meddle in other people's affairs, but he thought it was odd. He had learned not to ask questions, and travelers had their own difficulties. Edmund was asked by the sheriff if he knew the whereabouts of the 3. They had suggested taking a train, but they hadn't mentioned where they were going, the innkeeper retorted. There were multiple routes available from the Decca train station: St. Louis to the southwest, Indianapolis to the east, and Chicago to the north. Not knowing which train, it was almost tough to track down the couple, regardless of whether they had taken or actually boarded. Porter went to the train station and talked with staff members who were employed there at the time. The ticket agent dimly recalled selling tickets to a small group that morning, but she was unable to recollect the characteristics or destinations of the passengers. Every day, hundreds of people went through the station. There was little chance of locating precise data, particularly since many passengers bought tickets using fictitious identities or just weren't registered correctly. More frustration than enlightenment resulted from Decada's lead. If the Hartleys were indeed the ones spotted at the inn, they were alive and seemed to be running from someone or something. Who was the third man, though? And why did Margaret appear to be in such distress? The sheriff started thinking about more sinister options. Maybe the pair was being pressured, compelled to abandon everything because they were in danger. Porter presented his research to the locals back in Mechanicsburg. There were several theories. There were many who thought James had become involved with crooks and was now suffering as a result. Others believed he had a romantic relationship that caused him to flee. Some even speculated that Margaret might be mentally ill, acting impulsively and dragging James down with her. These explanations were all insufficient. In March, the Springfield Journal released a longer piece about the case that included pictures based on the Hartleys' claims and once more asked anyone, with details for getting in touch with them. Readers in a number of Illinois cities and nearby states were drawn to the article. Investigations revealed that all of the sightings reported by some persons were false alarms. The route left by the Hartley was still icy. The story started to recede from the press as the weeks went by and spring drew near. Life went on as usual as other events dominated the news. However, for those who were personally engaged, particularly Sheriff Porter and the couple's few close friends, the enigma yet lingered. The fields on the Hartley farm were left unplanted, and the vacant house silently observed occurrences that no one could fully understand. A Thor arrived in the spring of 1904, bringing with it a discovery that would surprisingly bring the case back to life. A party of fishermen discovered something unsettling on the banks of the Sangamon River, approximately 10 miles from the deserted Hartley farm in mid-April, when the creeks and streams started to flow freely again after months of freezing it. Only because the riverbank had been shifted by the spring rains was a suitcase partially buried in the mud and drenched. The bag was brought to the local sheriff's office by the fishermen, who live in the little town of Athens. William Porter was contacted right away. Everyone was shocked to see what was inside the luggage when it was opened. Good quality women's clothes, some still with Springfield retail tags. Additionally, a tiny case with inexpensive yet priceless jewels was there. Among them was a brooch that several women in Mechanicsburg recognized right once as being Margaret Hartley's. It was a wedding present from her late mother that she wore to church on Sundays. Unsettling questions were raised by the discovery. If the pair were running away, why would Margaret abandon such priceless and intimate belongings? Did it make sense to leave possessions like those behind, as Decatur witnesses suggested? Most significantly, how did this luggage go so far from the path and wind up on the Sangamon River's banks? How long would it have taken them to get to Deka? Porter coordinated a more thorough riverbank search. For days, dozens of volunteers searched the riverbank for additional evidence, or, in the worst case, for bodies that might have been washed away. The hunt continued for miles past Athens, down the river, and into more populous areas where the Sangamon met. There was nothing else discovered. The suitcase continued to be a single mystery, a piece of a puzzle that had no place. The sheriff made the decision to review the case from start to finish. Now, shrouded in early spring foliage, he went back to the Hartley farmhouse and carried out an even more exhaustive investigation. One of his subordinates discovered something that had previously gone overlooked during this reopened probe. There was a hollow in the stone wall in the house's basement, concealed by shelves of dusty canned goods. There was a diary inside, covered with oilcloth to keep moisture out. Margaret was the owner of the diary. The entries began in 1901, and continued sporadically until December 1903, a few weeks before she vanished. The contents showed a woman totally different from the one the community knew, and the handwriting was firm but delicate. Margaret wrote of her intense loneliness, the challenges of living so alone, and the secrets that plagued her but she was unable to share. Margaret wrote in September 1903 that she and James frequently argued over money. She disapproved of his economic dealings, but she didn't describe precisely what. She spoke of guys who came to the property late at night and left before daybreak. Strangers. Sensing that something perilous was coming to their life, she wrote with increasing concern. The last entry in the diary, which was made on December 18, 1903, was especially unsettling. Margaret wrote quickly, some of the words almost unintelligible. She brought up a choice that would alter everything that James had decided without her input. She described a man who had shown up that afternoon, a visitor from James's past, delivering information that clearly unsettled her husband. Margaret said she was afraid they were being pulled into an unavoidable situation. As though she had been interrupted, the entry ended abruptly and without a conclusion. Porter brought the diary to Mechanicsburg and read it repeatedly, attempting to get as much information as he could. Margaret's description depicted a couple hiding parts of their lives from the community while living under growing stress. However, what was James actually doing? Who were these nighttime guests? Who was the man who was mentioned in the previous entry? The sheriff made the decision to learn more about James Hartley's background. Up until that point, everyone thought he was just a regular farmer who had moved to Illinois years before from somewhere else. But precisely where? Porter requested information on any James Hartley who would match the missing man's description in letters to surrounding states and counties. In May, the responses started to come in, and what they showed was unexpected. Records of a James Hartley involved in a financial scandal in 1897 were found in Henderson County, Kentucky. Before authorities could investigate James about fraudulent investments that had caused hardship for other families, he vanished. Although it was impossible to be positive that it was the same individual, the physical description matched rather well. Additionally, Porter learned from Indiana that a man bearing the same name had been examined in relation to the 1899 state-to-state smuggling of goods. The culprit had once again vanished before being charged. There were too many coincidences to overlook. It was becoming more and more plausible that James Hartley was someone with a troubled background that had now caught up with him, rather than the person the Mechanicsburg community thought he was. This discovery fundamentally altered how the case was perceived. James's covert activities would make sense if he was fleeing from prior offenses, conducting business, and welcoming dubious guests. Maybe January's events were the culmination of his past finally catching up with him. However, Margaret's inquiry persisted. Was she a victim or an accomplice? According to the diary, she was initially ignorant of a lot of James's activities. After looking through county marriage records, Sheriff Porter found that James and Margaret had tied the knot in Springfield in 1898. There were no prior recordings of them in the area shortly after their arrival in Illinois. Porter was able to track Margaret's family back to a little Ohio town since she had used the last name Mitchell prior to her marriage. He sent a letter to the local authorities asking for details regarding the Mitchell family. The mystery was further complicated by the response. After her parents passed away in 1897, Margaret moved to the West, according to the Mitchell family. After mentioning in letters that she had found a man and intended to get married, her correspondence became irregular. Her most recent correspondence with her sister came from Margaret appeared content in 1899, discussing her goals for the future and life on the farm. Nothing hinted at danger or difficulty. What had changed then? How could a woman who in 1899 seemed to be happy with her life have descended into the anxiety and despair that her diary entries in 1903 revealed? 4 years had gone by, which was enough time for a lot to happen, secrets to come to light, and illusions to crumble. Margaret had learned something about James that terrified her but from which she was unable to flee. Porter started planning a timeline of the events. James may have fled problems in Kentucky before arriving in Illinois in 1897 or 1898. Margaret was a young, fragile woman who had recently lost her parents, and he married her. They kept a low profile after settling on the Mechanicsburg estate. Things appeared to be normal for a few years. However, James's background started to come to light at some point in 1902 or 1903. Visitors showed up at night. There were dubious transactions. Margaret learned unsettling facts. Something occurs in December 1903 that leads to a emergency. A man from James's past shows up with demands or news. There may have been threats. It's possible that James has debt or is embroiled in a situation from which he is unable to escape. A crucial choice must be made by the pair. Along with the third individual, the young man from Decatur, they go quickly in January 1904, leaving everything behind. Sheriff Porter's theory was starting to come together, but there were still a lot of unanswered questions. The problem with the discovered suitcase remained inexplicable in the river. Why would the pair throw away Margaret's belongings so thoughtlessly if they were running away? Why did they decide to go the Sangamon River instead of the Dakar route? There was more to these contradictions than just a straightforward escape. Unexpectedly, a new witness appeared in June 1904. Sheriff Porter was approached by a train employee who had been unwell for months and was only now becoming aware of the case through the newspapers. Robert Hayes, a man who struggled to maintain the lines that passed through Sangamon County. Around the 12th or 13th on a chilly January night, he reported what he had seen. He was unable to remember the precise date. Robert noticed a wagon parked next to the tracks while he was examining a remote section of railroad close to the area known as Clear Lake. It was extremely cold, and it was late. It was past 9 o'clock at night. It was the conduct of those in the wagon that drew his attention. 3 people were present, a woman and 2 men. One of the men was obviously upset, nervously making gestures and looking back and forth at the tracks as though they were waiting for something. Wrapped in blankets, the woman sat in the rear of the wagon. The distance and darkness made it difficult for Robert to see her face clearly, but he could see that she appeared to be immobile despite the bitter cold. The second younger man calmed the horses by staying by their side. Robert thought about going over to help, but something about the scene unnerved him. A noticeable tension was present in the air, a feeling that he wouldn't be welcomed there. About an hour later, he went back the same way to continue his inspection, but the wagon was gone. After giving it some thought over the course of the following few days, Robert eventually forgot about the incident and dismissed it as the difficulties faced by regular travelers during the winter. He didn't realize these individuals might be the missing couple until months later, when he read about the Hartley case. The account of Robert Hayes added a new depth to the enigma. Although it wasn't on the direct path to Dakar, Clear Lake was situated between Mechanicsburg and the Sangamon River. Why would they be waiting in the middle of the night close to the tracks? Porter thought about a number of options. Maybe they were waiting for a freight train to stop at this remote location so they could travel covertly. Or maybe they were meeting someone who had just arrived by train. The sheriff went to Clear Lake to look for himself. The area was barren, with small woods and deserted fields all around. Seldom utilized for passenger transportation in that area, the railroad cut a lonely path through the landscape. Periodically, freight trains passed, transporting goods and agricultural products between major cities. It was the perfect location for a covert meeting if someone wanted to stay out of the spotlight. Porter talked to other railroad employees who were familiar with the region. One of them brought up unverified rumors that occasionally, freight trains carried more than just legal goods. They also carried stolen goods, illegal alcohol, and even individuals attempting to travel without being recognized or paying. Although it didn't occur frequently, it wasn't completely unusual at the time. This knowledge created a fascinating opportunity. James Hartley may have connections that would enable him to set up covert transportation if he was associated with criminal elements, as his prior record indicated. The young man spotted with. The couple might serve as a go-between, responsible for making sure they boarded covertly and safely. This would account for the fact that they were spotted in both Clear Lake and Deka, perhaps utilizing various means of transportation to thwart any attempts to locate them. However, that scenario was still not supported by the suitcase in the river. Porter re-examined the evidence. Margaret's jewelry and clothes were in the bag, but James's personal belongings were not. This implied that it might not have been thrown out on purpose rather than out of panic or accident. For some reason, someone wanted those things found, or at the very least was prepared to get rid of them. The sheriff thought about a bleak prospect. What if Margaret didn't choose to travel? According to witness accounts, she appeared apprehensive, terrified, and quiet. Even in the bitter cold, Robert Hayes saw that she stayed still in the wagon, wrapped in blankets. Maybe they're holding her against her will. Maybe James was desperate and feeling pressured by his. Past issues had committed an unimaginable act. Porter re-examined Margaret's diary with a new perspective as a result of this line of thinking. Growing fear, references to choices James made without consulting her, and a sense of being pulled into something horrible were all revealed in the final entries. Although Margaret never stated it in her writing, it was clear that she was in danger. Maybe she was aware that she was stuck in a situation she didn't fully comprehend, but knew instinctively that she couldn't get out of, as harmful. Porter got an unexpected letter in July. It came from a Springfield attorney who defended Hartley estate-related interests. It appears that the farm was initially acquired through a loan that James never paid back in full, with the couple going missing and no payments being made. The bank was suing to take the property away. Since the Hartleys' whereabouts would have an impact on the legal proceedings, the lawyer wanted to know if there had been any updates. This financial information incorporated an additional layer into the puzzle. James had debt and might have been in dire need of cash. This would account for his dubious business dealings and the nighttime visitors Margaret was afraid of. Perhaps James was much more deeply involved in illegal activities than anyone realized, and the financial issues were only the beginning. After requesting bank records, Porter learned that James had nearly spent all of his savings in December 1903 due to large withdrawals from his account. A couple. Days later, a sizable deposit was made, much more than the typical farmer would have contributed. It was unclear where this money came from. It had nothing to do with any sales of crops or livestock. Where had James obtained this sum, and why did they forfeit other savings that were concealed in the barn despite having the money? These monetary exchanges implied that a noteworthy event had occurred in December. Someone had given James money, perhaps in connection with the dubious activities described in Margaret's diary. However, there was a cost to this money. It might have been payment for a service James was expected to provide. Or maybe it was because he had already done something that now needed him to vanish as soon as possible. Throughout the summer of 1904, the sheriff worked to make sense of all these disparate pieces of information. He had created a plausible story. Under the guise of respectability, James Hartley, a man with a criminal history, relocated to Illinois. At first, unaware of his secrets, Margaret gradually learned the truth about her spouse. James's past started to catch up with him by 1903, putting him in dangerous situations that were difficult for him to get out of. A last crisis compelled James to take action in the winter of 1904. Regardless of Margaret's desire to accompany him, he grabbed all the money he had on hand, arranged with those who could assist him vanish, and set out. They avoided major thoroughfares and official routes by using wagons and freight trains. Stations. For unknown reasons, Margaret's personal possessions wound up in the river after she was separated from them at some time, perhaps before or during the trip. Although many of the known facts were explained by this theory, there were still other aspects that didn't completely match. Margaret's behavioral indication. For instance, Why didn't she approach the innkeeper for assistance if she was being coerced? Why didn't she make an attempt to flee? Maybe her youthful buddy was keeping a tight eye on her. Or maybe she still had some hope or loyalty for James in spite of her anxiety. With the arrival of autumn, the case took an unexpected turn. Authorities in Cairo, a port city at the southern tip of Illinois, where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers converge, sent Sheriff Porter an urgent telegram in September 1904. The information was brief but startling. On the docks, a woman had been discovered wandering. Confused and incapable of giving a clear description of who she was, Margaret's physical attributes matched. Hartley. Porter left right away for Cairo, a trip that required over 2 days because of the required rail connections. The city was well known for being a center for a variety of traders and travelers, with rivers acting as liquid thoroughfares that transported people and products in all directions. In addition, it was a place where it was easy to blend in with the masses of sailors, dock workers, and passing travelers. Porter was brought to a tiny infirmary at the Cairo local sheriff's office, where the woman was under surveillance. His assumptions were validated as soon as he saw her. Margaret Hartley was undoubtedly there, but the woman in front of him was not at all like the one the Mechanicsburg community remembered. Her hair, which had previously always been meticulously pulled back, was unkempt and lopsided. Unlike the modest but well-maintained gown she always wore, her clothing were worn out and basic. She seemed to be physically there but otherwise absent, as evidenced by the remote look of her eyes. Porter came over. Calmly and carefully, he introduced himself. Margaret didn't instantly recognize him when she looked at him. He included the farm, Mechanicsburg, and the names of acquaintances and neighbors. She started to shake. Tears welled up in her eyes, and something appeared to awaken in her memory gradually. The sheriff patiently waited for her to take it all in. At last, she said her own name in a voice that was almost audible. It was the first indication of clarity she had displayed since her discovery a few days prior. The local. Porter was informed by the doctor who had checked Margaret that she seemed to be experiencing severe physical and mental exhaustion. She was undernourished and exhibited symptoms of prolonged exposure to difficult circumstances. Although there was no indication of any severe injuries, her mental state was quite worrisome. She mumbled incomprehensible things about rivers, voyages, and locations the doctor could not recognize, alternating between periods of total stillness and times of agitation. Over the following 3 days, Porter traveled to Cairo, visiting Margaret every day and making an endlessly patient effort to find out what had transpired since January. The process was disjointed and slow. Margaret struggled to arrange her ideas in a linear fashion. Her recollections appeared disorganized, combining incidents into sequences that didn't make sense right away. However, a narrative started to take shape gradually, piece by piece. She acknowledged that they had moved away from the farm in January, but not voluntarily. With a faltering voice, she stated that James was desperate. The farm was visited by men. Throughout the past weeks, men making demands James couldn't reject. He owed money, a lot of it, tied to business dealings Margaret never completely understood. These folks were not known for their tolerance or compassion, so James attempted to bargain for additional time. It was a tumultuous night when they left. James told her they had to go right away after waking her up late. There was no time for comprehensive explanations or careful packing. He put some clothing into a suitcase and hustled her out of the house. A young man was waiting for them with a cart, someone James introduced as just a helper. Margaret was horrified, not entirely comprehending what was occurring, but seeing the true dread in her husband's eyes. They traveled through the frigid night, avoiding key routes. Margaret remembered the terrible cold, the continual terror, the feeling of being chased, though she never clearly saw who or what. They halted near the tracks. She recognized it as the area Robert Hayes had described months previously. There, they waited for hours, James continually peering around, the young man keeping the horses motionless. Finally, a freight train slowed down enough for them to board one of the empty cars. The train voyage was an event Margaret characterized as a never-ending nightmare. The carriage was frigid with no heat or comfort whatsoever. They traveled like that for hours, maybe an entire day. She wasn't sure. The train occasionally stopped, and at one point James hurried her off. They were somewhere she didn't identify but later realized was near Decatur. It was there, amid the bustle of the stop, that anything happened to her suitcase. Margaret couldn't remember the specific details. Her recall of that occasion was particularly foggy. James and the young man disagreed about something. Their voices increased but stayed quiet. The bag had been left behind. She felt confident of it, but she couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was too heavy. Perhaps James felt it might attract unnecessary attention. Somehow, the bag had wound up in the river, though Margaret had no idea how. In Decatur, they spent a night in the inn, exactly as Edmund Price had reported. Margaret recalls being too fatigued to clearly absorb what was happening. She heard James and the young man conversing in hushed tones, making arrangements they didn't disclose with her. In the morning, they boarded a train again, this time as regular travelers, using names that weren't their own. James had fraudulent documents, something that disturbed Margaret severely. How many secrets was her husband keeping? They traveled south, going through various towns. Margaret lost track of time and place. They stopped occasionally, stayed a few days at inexpensive inns, then went on. James looked to be searching for something or someone, but never stated fully. The young man who had accompanied them from the beginning stayed with them for a few weeks, then vanished one night without notice. Margaret woke up and he was simply gone. After that, it was just her and James going with no obvious destination. Her husband was visibly changing. The man she knew, even with all his secrets, was tormented by anxiety and sorrow. He saw threats around every corner, suspicious of every stranger who looked his way. They began to run out of money, needing to accept temporary employment at farms and businesses along the road. At some time, Margaret couldn't specify when they landed in Cairo. The town was chaotic and boisterous, so different from the pastoral quiet of Mechanicsburg. James stated they needed to find passage on a boat that would move them downriver, possibly to New Orleans, where they might start over completely. He was more agitated, sleeping little, continually peering over his shoulder. It was on one of those nights in Cairo that everything went apart for good. Margaret awakened alone in the modest room they shared in a guest house near the docks. James had left, stating he would be back in a few hours. But when daylight arrived, he still hadn't returned. She waited all day, then another day. On the third morning, she accepted the sad fact. He had abandoned her. Margaret had no money, no one she knew, no way to get home, or even if she still had a house to return to. The shock of this knowledge, coupled with months of anxiety and fear, ultimately snapped something inside her. She walked the streets of Cairo, lost not only physically but mentally. The following days were a fuzz in her memory. She remembers frightened faces, people attempting to talk to her, but she couldn't react coherently. Finally, someone took her to the authorities, and that's how the local sheriff found her. Porter listened with a mixture of compassion and irritation. Margaret's account introduced fresh issues while also filling in numerous gaps. Now, where was James? After running away together for months, why had he deserted his wife? Had he really gotten into a boat and gone downriver, or was he hiding someplace in Cairo? And just who were these folks they were running from? In Cairo, the sheriff carried out his own inquiry, saying, with dock workers, boarding house proprietors, and everyone who may have seen James Hartley. A few people dimly recalled a man who fit the description, but nobody knew for sure where he was now. People were always coming and going from Cairo, which was a transit town. It would be easy for a lone individual who wanted to vanish. Porter also looked into the ships that had left Cairo when James vanished. Several steamships traveled the southern route, transporting people and cargo. The records were not consistent. Particularly when the passengers paid cash and didn't cause any difficulty, many captains didn't maintain thorough records of who boarded. James might have been as far away as Louisiana, or perhaps more afield by now, but it was quite conceivable that he was somewhere along the Mississippi. Porter stayed in Cairo for a few more weeks to make sure Margaret received the right care and time to restore her strength, because she was too physically weak to leave right away. Over this period, he kept gathering additional information from her disoriented recollections. She listed the locations they had visited and the names of the cities she could recall. Porter painstakingly documented everything in the hopes that a single detail would eventually point to James. Porter focused on looking into the hints Margaret had given him while she slowly recovered her strength. He was particularly interested in one piece of information. Margaret had reported that James had been noticeably shaken when he got a telegram while they were staying in a little village south of Dakar, despite the fact that she vividly recalled her husband's response even though she was unaware of the message's substance. He burned the telegraph in their room's fireplace after reading it several times. Porter went to the town in Marion County, which Margaret named as Centria. After describing the purpose of his inquiry, he went to the telegraph office and was granted access to the telegrams sent and received during the relevant time frame. It was like trying to find a needle in a haystack to find the precise one. However, he eventually found a fascinating entry. In February 1904, he sent a telegram from St. Louis to an address he only specified as J. Hart. The recorded material was suggestive but cryptic. The agreement was broken. The situation is unsustainable. No turning back. Porter didn't immediately understand the initials used to sign the note, but the tone was clear. The substance of this correspondence, which was between individuals engaged in dubious activities, implied that something had gone horribly wrong. If James Hartley was the intended recipient of this telegraph, it would elucidate why getting it made him even more desperate. The sheriff made the decision to visit St. Louis once more. The metropolis was far bigger and more intricate than any other place he had looked into in Illinois. Finding particular ties to James Hartley looked almost hard given the hundreds of thousands of residents, but Porter persisted, and he finally had a place to start. The message had been dispatched from the telegraph office. The clerk who had responded to the message did not remember specifics. However, documents revealed that the telegram had been sent from a business area close to the river. Porter spent days touring the region, stopping by establishments and chatting with locals and business owners. He eventually found a crucial clue in a tavern frequented by dock workers. Although he knew James Hartley by a different name, the establishment's owner, Heinrich Müller, a German immigrant, recalled him. The man had visited his establishment several years prior, Heinrich clarified, always in the company of other people. Heinrich said it's best to avoid getting too close to them. These men engaged in illicit gaming, backroom transactions, illegal imports of products and loans to needy people with high interest rates. James, or whatever he was at the time, had developed a close relationship with this group. Heinrich had heard that he had attempted to scam some extremely dangerous people and owed large sums of money. Heinrich didn't completely get the specifics of the confrontation, and afterwards James just vanished from St. Louis. This would have occurred in 1897 or 1898. Precisely when the documents indicate he had met Margaret after arriving in Illinois. The plot was starting to take shape. James Hartley moved to Mechanicsburg under the guise of respectability after leaving St. Louis with debts and dangerous adversaries. He was able to conceal his history for a few years, but finally, the people he had run away from discovered him. Margaret's diary presumably described nightly visits by debt collectors or intermediaries hired to make demands, payment of past due bills that have accumulated interest over time. Through Heinrich, Porter had acquired a few names that were thought to have been connected to those dubious activities years prior. Some were incarcerated, many had died, and others had vanished. However, one name in particular caught my attention. A man known only as Dalton, who was said to be quite dangerous and in charge of much of the illicit activities in the Port District. James's frantic flight from Illinois could be explained by the extent of his desperation if he owed Dalton money. When the sheriff attempted to find Dalton, he found that the man was as elusive as a shadow. Everyone seemed to know him, yet no one acknowledged having a personal acquaintance with him. He never identified himself directly and instead worked through middlemen. Porter realized that he was dealing with a person who had meticulously erected barriers around himself, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to get to him. Porter returned to Cairo in late October, frustrated but not defeated. Margaret was both much superior, both psychologically and physically. Her eyes no longer had that aloof, terrified expression, and she had put on weight. She was able to speak more clearly, but she was still clearly unhappy about several subjects. As long as the trip was made cautiously and slowly, the doctor said she was well enough to travel. Porter made arrangements for her to travel the few days back to Mechanicsburg. After all that had transpired, Margaret was nervous about going back, since she didn't know how the community would accept her. She was reassured by the sheriff, who said that people were both relieved and concerned that she was still alive. Most of her neighbors sympathized with her predicament, and word had spread about her forced absence. Margaret encountered a range of responses when they eventually reached Mechanicsburg in November. Some greeted her with open arms and rejoiced that she had returned safely. Others remained wary, not knowing the specifics of what had transpired and possibly believing she was more knowledgeable about James's company then. She acknowledged it. Overgrown with wild flora that had grown while she was away, the farm remained, now in a state of advanced neglect. Margaret had no desire to go back to the farm. Because of the secrets and anxieties that had plagued her final months there, the memories of that location were too traumatic. While she made life decisions, her church family provided temporary accommodation. The foreclosure was still being processed by the bank, and it appeared that she would lose the land regardless. Porter carried out his inquiry over the course of the following few weeks, now concentrating on finding James. In his correspondence, he sent comprehensive descriptions and a call to action to officials in communities along the Mississippi. Suspecting that the multicultural metropolis would be the ideal setting for someone like James to attempt to blend in with the different throng, he also got in touch with New Orleans deputies. Nearly a year after the first disappearance in December 1904, Porter got a positive report from New Orleans. The city's waterfront areas had been frequented by a man who fit James Hartley's description, living in filthy conditions and occasionally working as a longshoreman. A local police officer who had heard about the case in a publication that was making the rounds in southern cities piqued the curiosity of the informant. Porter thought about going to New Orleans himself, but the winter conditions made the trip very challenging and time-consuming. In addition, there were intricate legal concerns. James Hartley wasn't officially wanted in Illinois for any particular offense. He had abandoned his wife and debts, which at the time were morally dubious but not necessarily illegal. Although it would be difficult to establish links to unlawful activity from years ago, Missouri authorities may have had charges that would have justified his arrest. The sheriff determined that working with New Orleans local officials would be the best course of action. giving them all the facts at their disposal and requesting that they monitor the suspect. James would eventually commit an error that would enable his capture if he was actually present. Porter also thought about telling Margaret, but he was unsure. After months of trauma, she was at last starting to reconstruct her life and finding some serenity, but the knowledge that James might be so close could reverse all of her gains. Life in Mechanicsburg continued in the meantime. 1904's winter was milder then, the last one, a blessing for tourists and farmers. Margaret started teaching sewing and crafts to the youth of the neighborhood as an assistant at a tiny local school. Although it was a tiny job, it provided her with a sense of purpose and a certain amount of financial autonomy. She avoided talking about James or the months she spent on the run in favor of concentrating on the here and now and the uncertain future she was attempting to create. Porter was both pleased and worried as he observed her development. He was aware that as long as there will always be a shade over Margaret's life because James was still at large. Then there was the issue of the St. Louis men who had compelled James to escape. If they were aware that Margaret had returned to Illinois, they might use her as leverage to make James come out of hiding if he still had any interest in her. Unpredictable developments occurred in 1905. Porter got unsettling news from New Orleans in February. The man who was recognized as Perhaps. Once more, James Hartley had vanished. The local cop who had been investigating the matter claimed that the suspect just ceased showing up at the locations he frequently visited. He was last seen chatting to two unidentified males on a foggy night close to the Port District warehouses. No one saw him again after that. The abruptness of this removal sparked questions right away. Even though New Orleans was known for being a lively city, it also had a very violent side. The port areas were under control by competing gangs fighting for territory and profitable commercial transactions. In these places, people often vanished, some voluntarily, others as a result of much darker circumstances. The Mississippi River's murky waters transported secrets that would never be discovered to the Gulf of Mexico. In order to prepare Margaret for the prospect that James would never be found again, Porter carefully explained this information to her. Her response was nuanced and challenging to understand. There was obvious relief, a feeling that maybe. At last, this chapter of her life might come to an end. However, there was also sadness not for the man James had shown himself to be, but rather for the delusion she had lost and the life she believed she had created that had fallen apart so utterly. She revealed to Porter something she had never said before. James had changed during their final days together in Cairo. A sort of solemn resignation replaced the panic and misery that had engulfed him. He talked about his regrets and decisions from years past that took him in a direction he was unable to go back. At that moment, Margaret understood that her husband had come to terms with the fact that there was no way out, and that his past would inevitably find a way to catch up with him. This insight gave Margaret's desertion a new perspective. Maybe James had abandoned her to keep her safe rather than out of fear or indifference. Had he been aware of the proximity of St. Louis's men, the final clash would have been unavoidable. It was understandable that he would attempt to get away. Margaret, from the circumstance. Perhaps the only truly unselfish deed he had performed in years, it was a desperate gesture of atonement. As Porter continued to get intermittent updates from New Orleans, he thought about this possibility. Nothing conclusive was found during the search for the missing man. In a city where the river provided a handy last stop for those looking to destroy evidence, the fact that no body was discovered didn't signify much. Eventually, local officials closed the case due to more urgent demands, their focus. Margaret's life continued to gradually change in Mechanicsburg. In March 1905, the bank eventually confiscated the Hartley farm, which was then sold to a young Ohio family. The site was cleared, damaged buildings were removed, and new ones were constructed by the new owners. The last tangible remnants of the past that had taken place there seemed to be being erased. Margaret viewed this as a good thing, a chance to let the land start over, free of the demons that had previously tormented it. She was acting in the same way. Furthermore, Margaret started taking an active part in church and community events in addition to her academic work. Gradually, the women who had initially avoided her embraced her return, that she had been a victim of events that were out of her control. Whispered conversations concerning her past periodically resurfaced, but as time went on, other events and the more pressing issues of daily living took their place. For his part, Porter never gave up on the case entirely. He maintained thorough records of everything he had discovered, every lead pursued, every hypothesis investigated. He occasionally got information that appeared pertinent. A rumor about a man who fit James's description. A sighting reported in some far-off city. With his usual attention, he looked into each of these reports, but none produced conclusive findings. Unexpected events that occurred in June 1905 reignited popular interest in the case. A wallet was discovered floating amid the trash swept up by a fisherman on the Mississippi River close to Memphis, Tennessee. The flow. There were damp, almost unreadable paperwork within, but a name was still discernible. Hartley, James. Additionally, there was a tiny, water-damaged but still identifiable photo of a couple that matched James and Margaret. Porter traveled to Memphis to personally inspect the items after being contacted by Memphis authorities. When Margaret saw the photograph, taken soon after their 1898 wedding, she knew the wallet was unquestionably James's. It was still unclear how the objects got into the river. They may have been lost under more sinister circumstances during a struggle or after something worse had occurred, or they may have been purposefully discarded, a symbolic gesture of identity abandonment. Newspaper coverage of the discovery was renewed. The public's attention briefly returned to the Hartley case, which had progressively disappeared from the news. Reporters came to Mechanicsburg in an attempt to interview Margaret, but she graciously turned down the majority of their requests. Porter made few remarks, highlighting the fact that the inquiry was ongoing, but the discovered wallet by itself could not yield many conclusive findings. In the meantime, Porter got an anonymous letter from Memphis that was postmarked but didn't reveal who sent it. Though cryptic, the content was suggestive. Look up Vicksburg. Where the river runs red, there are answers. About 150 miles south of Memphis was the Mississippi city of Vicksburg. The vague mention of the river running red might have been a reference to the Civil War, as horrific conflicts had occurred in that area decades before. Porter pondered if the letter was merely a hoax, an attempt to take advantage of the resurgence of interest in the case. However, he was intrigued by the message's tone, a certainty that implied actual knowledge was present. After deciding to look into it, he made the long drive to Vicksburg and coordinated with the local authorities there. Thomas Garrett, the sheriff of Vicksburg, was helpful and curious about the case. He was interested in the Hartleys' relationship to his town because he had read about them in the newspapers. Garrett carried out initial investigations, interviewing locals and business owners to see if anyone who fit James' description had been spotted nearby. The reactions were unexpectedly favorable. Earlier in the year, a number of locals remembered a man who fit James's description working temporarily in the warehouses by the river. Although he went by a different name, such as John Harrison or James Harrison, his physical attributes were strikingly similar. This man had seldom made an appearance, interacting with others, concentrating only on work, and retiring to a rented room at the end of each day. The most interesting fact is that this man had abruptly left Vicksburg in late January 1905, right around the time of the New Orleans disappearance. He left one morning and never came back. even though he paid his rent in advance until the end of the month. Even so, the landlord retained a few possessions that were worthless and didn't justify the trouble of finding him. Porter looked over these possessions cautiously. Simple clothing, some old books, and papers with notes that appeared to be financial calculations were all present. One of these documents, a draft of a never-sent letter to Margaret, caught his attention. It appeared to be written by trembling hands or under intense emotional stress due to the uneven handwriting. Although the content was fragmentary, it conveyed sincere regret and apologies for everything that had been done. James wrote about how his decisions had ruined both her life and his own. He stated that he had attempted to move on from his past, but discovered too late that some obligations could never be fully paid back. It seemed as though he had been interrupted or had given up on finishing the letter because it ended abruptly without a signature or appropriate conclusion. Porter was not sure whether to show Margaret the document, so he kept it safe. Porter spent weeks trying to track down James Hartley's final movements in Vicksburg as part of the investigation. Sheriff Garrett, who was familiar with Vicksburg's social scene, turned out to be a useful ally. Complexity and shadowy areas. They went together to bars, gaming establishments, and other places where men in hiding or on the run sometimes sought safety. The tales they were told gradually built a picture of a man who lived in the shadows and was always on the lookout. James, or John Harrison as he called himself, was particularly fondly recalled by a bartender at a nearby riverfront business. The man had been to the bar a couple of times, usually drinking by himself in a dimly lit corner, and never spoke to anyone. But on one of those evenings, he appeared very distressed. The bartender saw that he was drinking more than normal, and that, despite his guarded demeanor, his hands were trembling all the time, and his eyes would dart anxiously at the sound of the door opening. And the bartender said something important. Two individuals who were obviously familiar with James came into the institution the last night he saw him. Although there was no overt conflict, the tension was evident. Soon after, James hastily departed. His drink was half empty. After a few minutes of waiting, the two men started walking in the same direction. After that evening, the bartender never saw either of them again. James vanished from his leased room in early February of 1905. Porter attempted to obtain descriptions of these two men, but the details were ambiguous. They both wore unremarkable, everyday clothing. Beyond the fact that one was taller and the other stockier, the bartender was unable to give precise information. The illumination in he served a large number of people every day, and the establishment was subpar. He could still clearly recall the men's menacing demeanor, which caused reasonable people to avoid them. These could be the St. Louis men who had first chased James, Sheriff Garrett said. It was conceivable that they had finally located him at Vicksburg after months of seeking. Throughout the South, the Mississippi was a vital conduit for communication and travel. In several port cities, persons engaged in illicit activity developed networks of informants. An individual attempting to hide would eventually be discovered, particularly if his assailants were tenacious and cunning. Porter explored the riverbank region for days, speaking with riverboat captains, dock workers, and anybody else who could have heard or seen something pertinent. At Vicksburg, the Mississippi was wide and towering, its murky waters flowing relentlessly south. It was simple to envision how this river has seen innumerable. Over the years, there have been many untold tales, some tragic, some triumphant. An unsettling remark was made by an elderly dock worker who had been loading and unloading boats at these ports for decades. He clarified that the river had means of concealing secrets, including intricate currents, unforeseen eddies, and submerged logs that trapped objects and permanently concealed them. Sometimes, due to changes in water levels or currents, something that had vanished months or even years before might unexpectedly come to the surface downstream. However, frequently, What the water carried was lost forever. Porter felt conflicted after this chat. A part of him realized that some stories just didn't have nice resolutions, but another part of him wanted to find conclusive answers to wrap up the case. James Hartley had vanished into the complexity of the American South during a period when it was easy to change one's identity, and the vastness of the region provided countless opportunities for both permanent disappearance and beginning afresh. Prior to departing Vicksburg, Porter spoke with Sheriff Garrett one last time. They talked about the case's nature, the probabilities involved, and the differences between what could be proven and what the evidence revealed. Garrett, who had been in law enforcement for more than 20 years, shared his knowledge. James Hartley, he thought, had probably not made it through his run-in with the men who were after him. The debts he owed and the enemies he had made all suggested a bleak conclusion that had left no trace. Porter returned in April 1905 to Illinois, bringing a sense of unfulfilled closure in James's incomplete letter with him. He hesitated, not sure how much to tell Margaret about his findings, even though he knew he had to. At last, he concluded that she should be aware of the truth, or at least what he had discovered. Even though the truth was unpleasant and lacking, Margaret had a right to know what had happened to the guy who had been her husband. On a calm afternoon, they got together at Margaret's place. Was alive. Porter carried the necessary paperwork, including the incomplete letter. Tears fell softly down her face as she read James's remarks. They weren't quite tears of mourning. Rather, they were a complex mixture of fury at the lies and deceit, sadness for the loss of a life, and maybe even a last glimmer of sympathy for the helpless creature James had turned into. Margaret questioned Porter about what he thought had actually occurred. The sheriff was truthful. He described the persons that were spotted in Vicksburg, the ominous ambiance of that final meeting, the brutality of those engaged in the sort of activity that had pulled James away. He didn't need to be specific for her to understand what he was saying. James was most likely dead, his body resting somewhere along the Mississippi, or possibly already transported by the unrelenting currents to the Gulf of Mexico. They both thought about this likely consequence for a long time. Margaret finally spoke, her voice solid even though she was crying. According to her, she required to let go that she had been stuck in the past and James' decisions for far too long. She had her entire life ahead of her and was still quite young. Though it didn't have to define her entirely, the past would always be a part of her, a scar she would bear. Regardless of what had transpired, a future remained to be constructed. Porter respected her fortitude. He assured her that he would keep her updated if fresh information became available. However, he also concurred that it was appropriate to officially put the lawsuit on hold. His files would stay open, and he would keep an eye out for any new information, but he would no longer invest a lot of resources in the hunt. There were other folks in need of assistance and other problems that need care. The Hartley story was progressively incorporated into Mechanicsburg's local legend over the course of the following few months. It became into one of those stories folks would sometimes tell, particularly on chilly winter nights when they were reminded of that awful January of 1904. As the narrative spread from person to person, details were either inflated or lost, changing into a hybrid of fact and legend. Margaret carried on with her life with remarkable tenacity. She increased the scope of her work at the school, rose to prominence in the neighborhood, and ultimately even found it possible to forgive, if not forget, what she had gone through. Every now and then, a newcomer would come to town, and, upon hearing her name, inquire as to whether she was Margaret Hartley from the 1904 events. She would just respond, yes, but that was in the past, and shift the topic. Porter never fully forget the case, even after years of resigning as sheriff. He maintained his files well organized, and occasionally on calm afternoons he would go over them and consider the intricacies of human nature that the case had shown. James's decisions, the consequences for innocent people, and the brittleness of truth and identity. There was one last significant development in 1907. In Louisiana, a body was discovered stuck in mangrove roots close to the Mississippi River. It was in a state that rendered. Identification is almost impossible. However, a pocket watch with engraved initials and pieces of paperwork were discovered amid the garment debris. Local officials inquired for missing persons who might match at a number of sheriff's offices upriver, including Mechanicsburg. Porter reviewed the data that was sent. The watch's initials matched, and although the body's description was imprecise because of its advanced level of decomposition, it did not conflict with what was known about James Hartley. However, there was impossible to confirm with certainty. There were few identification techniques available at the time, and DNA was not yet a tool. Porter chose not to share this finding with Margaret. It seemed needless and cruel to bother her with conflicting facts when she had at last found serenity. For all parties engaged in the Hartley case, the years that followed brought about slow but significant improvements. Mechanicsburg expanded slowly. Older families went, and new ones settled. Under its new owners, the farm that had belonged to James and Margaret flourished, utterly ignorant of the location's troubled past. Production resumed in the fields. The home gained warmth it had not had in the prior years, and the barn was restored. During those horrible months on the run, Margaret, for her part, discovered a kind of happiness she had never thought imaginable. She met Robert Sullivan, a widower who was a teacher at the school where she worked, in 1908. After losing his wife to illness a few years prior, he moved to Mechanicsburg from Indiana with 2 adult children in search of a new beginning, years before. Everyone in town knew Margaret's story, including Robert, but he didn't see a tragic lady in Margaret. Instead, he saw someone who had persevered and rebuilt herself with incredible dignity. With the inherent caution of 2 individuals who had experienced loss and disappointment, the relationship grew slowly. They discussed books, pedagogy, and their worldviews in great detail. Margaret was never under any duress from Robert to discuss James or the events of 1904, but he did make it apparent that he was available if she required him. After everything Margaret had gone through, she was won over by this respect and patience in a manner that strong passion could never have. Margaret had been a long-time member of the same Baptist church, where they were married in a modest ceremony in 1909. Seeing the union as a kind of atonement and rejuvenation, the community joyfully celebrated it. In addition to becoming Robert's wife, Margaret became a mother figure to his kids, who greeted her with unexpected warmth. It was a family formed not by blood but by decision and a shared desire for interpersonal relationships. Porter, who is now retired but still resides in Mechanicsburg, had mixed emotions when he and his wife attended the wedding. He was truly delighted for Margaret, but his thoughts kept returning to James Hartley and the terrible results of one man's decisions made decades before. Officially, the case had never been closed. For all intents and purposes, it was over, even though it was still open in the county records. It was assumed that James was deceased. Margaret went on, and if justice was present in this tale, it had manifested itself in strange and flawed ways. The former sheriff occasionally corresponded with law enforcement in towns along the Mississippi and its tributaries. He occasionally heard about missing people, dead discovered, and cases that appeared to be identical to James Hartley's. He did a quick investigation into each, but none produced conclusive results. The river remained silent and effective in keeping its secrets. Porter was presented with an unexpected guest, An old man in plain, clean clothes showed up at his door and inquired about the Hartley case. He introduced himself as Samuel Dalton, younger brother of the Dalton who had been named in St. Louis years before. Samuel clarified that his brother had just died and had made certain revelations that troubled him. Information on James Hartley was one of these confessions. While the elderly guy collected his thoughts, Porter invited Samuel inside and offered him coffee. Samuel clarified that his brother had actually spent years as a key player in the criminal underworld in St. Louis. He was in charge of illicit lending, illicit gaming, and other operations that took place in the background of civil society. In the late 1890s, James Hartley was heavily involved in these enterprises and accrued large debts that he was unable to pay back. Samuel's brother was incensed when James left St. Louis. Although money played a significant role, reputation was also at stake. Giving someone permission to disobey authority and get away with it would inspire others to follow suit. In order to discover James, he dispatched men, a hunt that took years but ultimately paid off. They followed him down the river, tracked him through Illinois, and eventually encountered him at Vicksburg at the beginning of 1905. Here, Samuel hesitated, obviously uneasy about what he had to say. Porter waited calmly, giving the man time to gather his courage. At last, Samuel went on. The altercation at his brother's original plans for Vicksburg did not work out. The men sent were instructed to return James alive to St. Louis so that he might use forced labor to settle his debts. James, however, objected. An altercation broke out with a fatal conclusion. The men became terrified. This was not what they had hoped for. Using the river as a silent collaborator, they disposed of the body the only manner they knew how in that particular situation. After that, they went back to St. Louis and informed Samuel's brother that James had vanished forever, a coded language that was understood by all. Samuel's brother wasn't happy. He had hoped that the matter would be rectified, but there was nothing he could do but accept it and move on. Porter's expression remained unbreakable as he took in this knowledge. At last, he inquired as to why, after all these years, Samuel was now telling him this. The elderly guy clarified that his brother had been plagued by regret in his last days. He requested that Samuel make an effort to help individuals impacted by his acts over the years. Samuel didn't like what his brother had done. He honored this last request from a dying man despite their stark differences in temperament and lifestyle choices. The former sheriff thought carefully about what to do. Although Samuel was not directly involved in the murder, he had just admitted to knowing about it. Yet this would make prosecution more difficult. The evidence was based on third-hand confessions from men who had died, and the events had taken place years previously in a different state. Additionally, Porter believed that reviving the case would only cause suffering and unwelcome attention for Margaret, who was now happily married. Porter made a choice that he thought was right, but others could disagree. He recorded the conversation in his own notes, thanked Samuel for visiting, and chose not to take any formal action. James Hartley had passed away. Even in the absence of a recoverable body for burial, that was now verified. Margaret didn't deserve a circus of court cases that would cautiously resurrect her. She deserved serenity, conquer traumas. Justice occasionally took on shapes that the courts were unable to effectively handle. Samuel seems appreciative and comforted by Porter's sympathetic demeanor. He added one more detail before departing. When he was confronted in Vicksburg, he had discovered a tiny box among his brother's possessions that contained goods that had been stolen from James. It contained a pocket knife, some coins, and an initial engraved wedding ring. Samuel felt that this ring should be appropriately returned, therefore he brought it. Porter agreed to the ring, looking at the initials J.H. and M.M., which stand for James Hartley and Margaret Mitchell, her maiden name respectively. It was a little item, but it held a lot of significance. It was a quiet record of good faith promises that were later broken by lies and deceit. Unsure of what to do with the ring, Porter kept it. Giving it to Margaret could bring up painful memories. It didn't feel right to keep it. Ultimately, he made the decision to keep it in his personal case files and let time decide what should happen to it. Over the ensuing years, Porter would sometimes take up that ring and look at it, considering what it stood for: shattered lives and broken promises, but also rebirth and survival. Margaret had rebuilt a meaningful life from the ruins and was once again happy. This showed the incredible resiliency of the human spirit, but it did not erase the past. Porter made the decision to systematically arrange all of his Hartley case files in 1915. He reviewed documents for weeks, arranged them chronologically, and added notes of explanation as needed. The objective was preservation rather than publishing or fame. He felt that the novel should be remembered for its lessons about human nature, the ramifications of decisions, and how uncontrollable forces may upend normal lives in addition to its dramatic occurrences. He sealed these documents and stipulated that they would not be accessible to the public for at least 50 years. Before the narrative was made public, he wanted to make sure Margaret and everyone intimately involved had lived their lives to the fullest. Understanding. He placed the records in the county archives so that they would be secure but still available to historians in the future who might be interested in learning more about that time period and those occurrences. As Porter had directed, the records were kept hidden, silently defending a tale that had rocked a little Illinois town decades before. Margaret spent the remainder of her life in Mechanicsburg, where she was cherished by her family and respected by the locals. At the age of 72, she died quietly in 1947. Despite the invisible wounds she always carried, she managed to create a rich and fulfilling life. Few people who were present at her funeral were fully aware of her story, and those who were kept quiet out of respect. Robert Sullivan joined his wife at a little cemetery in the hills above Mechanicsburg after only 3 years of marriage. Their graves were basic but well-maintained, with only their names, dates, and a little note about perseverance and love on the headstones. James Hartley of the winter was not mentioned, of the frightening and perplexing months of 1904. Margaret buried that part of her life as deeply as any body in Mississippi. One of the most fascinating instances in Illinois criminal history was painstakingly documented when the Porter files were eventually opened in the 1960s. The intricacy of the story, the many levels of tragedy and deceit, and the journey of a lady from darkness to light captivated historians and scholars. Some authored scholarly works, while others included the case in American criminal history books. This time, the Hartley story was reintroduced to the public as a historical narrative that had been separated by time. The fourth generation of the family that had bought it in 1905 continued to run the farm where it all started. Although they had a hazy understanding of the property's history, it had little bearing on their day-to-day existence. The fields continued to yield results. Modern machinery was kept in the barn, and the home had undergone so much renovations that no physical. There was still evidence of the Hartleys. It was land cleared of all remnants of the past, cultivated by honest hands to provide sustenance for far-off populations. Sangamon County was still traversed by the Sangamon River, whose waters bore witness to the changing of the seasons and carried tales that no one would ever fully understand. Ignorant of the human dramas that took place along its banks over the ages, the Mississippi proceeded on its magnificent course toward the Gulf. Rivers have quiet memories that are long and contain secrets that only they know. Only pieces when they decide to do so. Over the years, Mechanicsburg expanded and evolved. New enterprises and inhabitants arrived with the construction of contemporary roadways. Margaret had worshipped in the Baptist church, which was rebuilt twice, each time making it bigger and more contemporary. She finally taught sewing at a tiny school that closed and was merged with other area institutions. Many of that era's physical landmarks have been lost to the present world. However, the tales endure in the communal memory of the community. Recall. Today's scholars can learn a number of lessons from the case, including the brittleness of identity, the inevitable emergence of secret pasts, and the repercussions of living a lie. James Hartley was a flawed man who made poor decisions and continued to do so until there was no turning back. He was not a monster. He nearly destroyed an innocent woman by dragging her down with him. Margaret, however, discovered an inner strength she was unaware she had. The narrative also discloses something about Justice's character. James was never put on trial. Even though he was never found guilty of his crimes, the harsh and final repercussions of his deeds came upon him without a judge's ruling. Margaret, on the other hand, created a new life, experienced true happiness, and passed away surrounded by affection, despite never receiving formal recompense or legal recourse for her suffering. Maybe this is her own imperfect but genuine kind of justice. Now, Porter's files. Digitized and available to scholars, they show the humanity of persons involved as well as the case's facts. His notes show real empathy for Margaret, an understanding of James's complexity, and a steadfast dedication to the truth even if it was painful or uncomfortable. He exemplified the best of law enforcement by striking a balance between responsibility and compassion, and never lost sight of the fact that he was dealing with actual human lives rather than just crimes that needed to be handled. In the end, the H. Hartley case became a part of Illinois folklore, recounted in variants that occasionally misrepresented the facts while maintaining the emotional heart of the tale. Some people still talk about the horrible January of 1904 when a couple vanished, leaving only mystery and questions, on chilly winter nights when the wind howls across Mechanicsburg's deserted fields. The narrative serves as a warning that human complexity and sinister tragedies can surface beneath the most tranquil exteriors, even in the most tranquil places. The wedding band that. After some time, Samuel Dalton had located a suitable place to return to Porter. Porter sent a statement outlining its provenance and requesting that it be included to the case files before to his own death in 1932. Decades later, when the archives were accessed, the ring was inspected, documented with photographs, and then given to the County Historical Museum. It is currently housed in a little display case that is a component of a local criminal history museum. It is a tiny item with an excessive amount of significance and memories attached to it. For those, the Hartley case provides a view into a very different yet oddly familiar world for those of us gazing back more than a century. Technologies have undergone significant modification. Once weekly communications are now immediate. It is far more difficult to create or give up an identity. However, basic human flaws, such as desperation that results in bad decisions and the capacity to persevere in the face of hardship, do not change over time. If Margaret Hartley Sullivan could talk to us now, she would most likely say that. Her tale is hardly the only one. She encountered difficulties unique to her time and location and lived in a different era. However, the basic ideas are universal. Betrayal, survival, and rebirth. These are universal human experiences that cut across all historical eras. Her narrative is significant not just because of its dramatic elements, but also because it serves as a reminder of the human spirit's tenacity and the potential for reconstruction even in the face of severe devastation. Every autumn, the fields surrounding Mechanicsburg continue to provide abundant harvests. The River Sangamon continues its calm journey across the Illinois countryside. The Mississippi River never stops flowing toward the ocean. The scars that individual events make on the earth are gradually erased as life continues. unrelenting, and rejuvenating. However, the tale of Margaret and James Hartley will live on, imparting its silent lessons to every new generation that chooses to hear it, as long as there are individuals to tell stories and those who care to remember. Among the most complicated and unsettling examples was this one, a tale that serves as a reminder that the truth is frequently more bizarre and intricate than fiction. We would love to hear your opinions if you have followed us this far on this trip through mystery, tragedy, and time. Please share your opinions about this case in the comments section. Which features drew your attention the most? You might want to subscribe to the channel if you appreciate stories like these. Numerous other stories are just waiting to be revealed. Numerous mysteries remain unsolved in the dusty records of long-forgotten nations. If this video touched you in any way, please like it. Manner and carry on delving into these tales with